This is Linux in Laws, a podcast on topics around free and open source software, any associated contraband, communism, the revolution in general, and whatever else fancies your tickle. Please note that this and other episodes may contain strong language, offensive humor, and other certainly not politically correct language. You have been warned. Our parents insisted on this disclaimer. Happy mum? Thus, the content is not suitable for consumption in the workplace, especially when played back on a speaker in an open plan office or similar environments. Any minors under the age of 35 or any pets, including fluffy little killer bunnies, your trusted guide dog, unless on speed, and cute T-Rexes or other associated dinosaurs. Welcome to Linux In-Laws, Season 2, Episode 4. Martin, how are things?
Yeah, things are great. What about yourself?
Well, can't complain. Now it's the year 2043. Russia has finally given up on the war, which is good news, I think.
You clearly don't work in marketing or post-production, or you would be complaining.
No, Martin, I don't. But this is not a show about post-production or some other ailments. I'm tempted to say post-production, if you're listening, this was just a joke.
You think they don't listen, they just cut bits out.
I hope the hope does last. But this is not a show about post-production, but rather about a very important project called the Software Freedom Conservancy. And without further ado, I would like to hand this over to Karen Sandler and Bradley Kuhn. Why don't you introduce yourself, people?
Oh, hi. I'm Karen Sandler. We do our own podcast once in a while. We're actually going to, Bradley, I hope you forgive me for pre-announcing that we're going to be launching or relaunching or newly launching one. And when we open those, I usually say, hi, I'm Karen Sandler.
And I'm Bradley Kuhn.
And we're with the Software Freedom Conservancy. So Software Freedom Conservancy is a charitable organization based in the United States, which is organized around all of the ethical issues surrounding free and open source software. And we've got like three major branches of the work we do. One is that we help support alternatives to proprietary software. The second is that we stand up for copyleft in the GPL. And the third is the recognition that free software won't be for everyone if it's not made by everyone. And we have diversity and inclusion initiatives like Outreachy.
Yeah, one of the ways I like to describe it is SFC, since our founding in 2006, one of the things we've always done is we've tried to take on anything we saw in the open source and free software world that was not being taken care of, that was very important. And we would just put that on our agenda to say that no other organization is handling this issue, working on it, and we feel like it needs to be done. And so that's how we ended up with the three areas that Karen is talking about.
And before we go even further, Karen, you already mentioned a very important acronym, the GPL. We did do an episode on open source licensing, but maybe not everybody has listened to this. And for those two people in the audience that do not know what a GPL is, maybe you can put this into perspective.
Sure. I'd love to introduce anyone who's listening to the idea of copyleft if you aren't familiar with it before. So the GPLs are a group of licenses and license agreements that are copyleft. And I know, Bradley, you love explaining this, so go ahead.
And also this has kind of been my role at SFC these days is as one of my roles. I have multiple roles, is as policy fellow, and I do a lot of work on the area of open source and free software policy and licensing in particular. So there are roughly two types of open source and free software licenses: copyleft and non-copyleft. The copyleft ones, frankly, are the most interesting ones because those are the ones that use legal mechanisms to assure the rights of individuals, users, and consumers to modify, improve, and share the software. And the way they do this is by putting requirements. When you share the software with other people, that's encouraged, but you have to give them the complete corresponding source code. So copyleft is a large class of types of licenses, and then the GPL family of licenses that Karen was talking about are the most popular copyleft licenses in use today.
That explains a lot. But maybe before we touch on current issues, the SFC has been around for quite some time, but so have the Open Source Initiative have the FSF, have the FSFE, have the EFF. Now, these are all organizations that look after the ideal of open source, or I'm almost going to say the idea of open source in general, and also specific issues. For example, the OSI as an open source initiative also does license validation. Maybe you can kind of explain how you fit into that context, and most importantly, I reckon, what the differences or the differentiators are between you and the other organizations that I just named.
Sure. Well, it's funny because we're actually much newer than those other organizations, which I think is pretty funny. So even though we've been around since 2006, that's newer than many of those other organizations. And we basically wind up I think that our real focus is that we do all of the pragmatic things that we think are absolutely necessary to forward software freedom. So that's been our focus and how we wound up with our three main branches of what we do. And I love saying branches because our logo as Software Freedom Conservancy is a tree, because we're conserving software rights for everyone to use. And so I'm kind of love that metaphor. And we have our branches, but all of the foliage, all of the things that are around the things that we do come up from the absolutely immediate need for software freedom. It's the things that we need to do to know that we can count on our technology and to be able to build the world in which our technology is responsive to its users' needs. So if you look at all of the things that we do, they're connected by this thread of what action can we take? How can we shape the world so that we give people these rights?
Yeah, and I the thing I would add to that is that it's really important in a social justice cause, which I view software rights and software freedom as one of the many important social justice causes in the world today. You need a very vibrant face of NGOs that are working in the area. One monolithic nonprofit organization is not ideal. You want lots of different organizations doing good work in different ways and on different agendas and on different important issues. What we focused on is, as we were saying earlier, the areas that really no other organization was addressing. And the two big areas that are really not addressed elsewhere other than at our organization are really taking a strong look at the underrepresentation of underrepresented groups in open source and free software. And our outreach initiative is focused on really actually funding people to come in from diverse groups. And really, we were Outreachy was really the first program to do this, to actually fund people to work on open source software, because there was this sense that you should be a volunteer first, and you need a tremendous amount of privilege to be able to do that. And so our program is really the only one doing that kind of work. And then on the copyleft enforcement side, really what I discovered, as I've worked with some of the other organizations you mentioned doing copyleft enforcement in the past, and I found that really nobody was doing it anymore. And SFC was really the only organization willing to do it. You might be familiar, for example, with Howard Velta's work with GPL violations. Amazing work that he did for many years in the early 2000s. But Harold is a very busy, brilliant software developer. He's moved on to other projects, and he's not doing GPL enforcement anymore. And so really, we were the only ones who are willing to take that on. And it's a very controversial issue in the industry, because the for-profit industry wants to get away with not following open source licenses. So we've just been the organization that's willing to take on these things that maybe are seen as a little more controversial by other organizations, but we think are so important to the social justice cause of software rights and freedom.
I think because we're, I was just going to say that. I think because because we're a slightly newer organization in that mix, I feel like we've been freer over the course of our, the work that we've done to kind of, make a new path and really focus on those issues of software rights and look at the implication of these issues in the public at large. And that's like the thread that unifies all of the work that we do, from copyleft enforcement to diversity and inclusion. So go ahead. Sorry about that.
No, by all means, Karen. Bradley, you just mentioned kind of your support for the cause. And needless to say, the VMware case that was, I'm almost going to say, recently brought up in Hamburg, as in Hamburg, Germany now, where a kernel developer apparently tried to drag VMware in front of court, citing GPL violations. If I remember correctly, this is about 5 to 7 years ago. Maybe I'm wrong. But just as an example, maybe you can shed some more light on this kind of specific case where you actually helped a kernel developer to fight for justice.
Yeah, and indeed we did. So Christoph Hellwig, he's been completely comfortable being publicly named, is a major contributor to Linux, and he's really one of the most important contributors, in my view, for policy reasons, which is that he's really been very careful to make sure that he keeps his own copyrights on his contributions to Linux. He doesn't give them away to his employer. Most Linux developers end up in a job where their employer gets all the rights to their software. Of course, it ends up being licensed upstream under GPL, but they don't have any copyrights in the software anymore because it went to their employer. Christoph is different. He's kept all his copyrights. And so when we discovered that VMware was violating the GPL in a really troubling way, we talked to Christoph, and he was very interested in bringing a case in Germany regarding that GPL violation. Ultimately, what happened was, after a lot of legal wrangling, and I think the German court, to be quite frank about it, was a little surprised that various different norms of German courts were not obeyed by VMware. They kind of brought in U.S. litigation teams and kind of were just doing U.S. litigation in a German court. It seemed like it was very offensive to the courts in Germany. But in the end, they weren't sure how to deal with this mess, and fortunately, VMware was able to come into compliance basically by discontinuing the product that was violating. So we did achieve compliance there, but it was hard fought, and ultimately we basically had to do it out of court.
Wow, that sounds serious. I wasn't aware actually that VMware tried these. I'm almost going to say tricks, but moves. Let's put it this way.
It was so funny that they one of the things they did, we were so surprised. Harold Velta, actually, I mentioned him before. He went to the hearing because he's, of course, even though he's not working day to day on GPL enforcement, he's still very interested in the topic, of course. He went to the hearing and said there was this goofy thing where they didn't even hire lawyers who could speak German. So they had like all these U.S. lawyers showed up and would make their argument in English, and then a translator would have to read off what they said in German, and then be translated back when the judges responded to back to English, which is really rude to do. You come to someone's country, you should hire a lawyer that speaks the local language. So we I think while we didn't get the legal ruling we would have loved in the VMware case, I think it showed the behavior of these companies that violate the GPL is really inappropriate. And that was just one example of how that happens.
Yeah, I think you have to basically expect that, like, people think that the GPL is, people will use the phrase magic pixie dust, right? You think that just because you license your software under a strong copyleft license, that it doesn't, that automatically you're set and the rules will be followed. But in actuality, non-compliance is so rife. So many companies are in violation. And when you do bring litigation, companies bring whatever dirty tricks they can. They do everything they can to slow things down, to make it more expensive, to make it more difficult. And what's worse is that because there are collections of companies, because companies in general don't want to have to follow the rules, they'll throw resources behind the ones that are defendants in these cases. So they're, anytime you bring a GPL enforcement action, you have to expect that company will be fully resourced very comfortably because so many companies that are not part of the lawsuit will want to make sure that there are as few obligations with copyleft as possible.
No, that's. I'm not personally familiar with that case, but I do know that VMware is a big open source supporter. In general, though, is it you mentioned the legal aspects in the license compliance and things like that. Is that the main focus of your activities, or clearly there are some other issues that open source software projects face these days, right? Are you doing any initiatives in that direction?
Yeah, I mean, we have a wide variety of initiatives that we do. And, VMware was that case that we did back then, but now we've more recently brought a lawsuit against Vizio directly as purchasers of a television to really talk about, to demonstrate that people who purchase equipment that have copylefted software on them have rights. And so, that's the case that we're working on now, as well as some other enforcement stuff. And probably by the time this airs, there might be some more information about it. But then that's just one of the three major branches. And so, running Outreachy, which is an initiative where we give paid remote internships to people who are subject to systemic bias and who are impacted by underrepresentation. And we do about 130 internships per year. We have another program called the Institute for Computing and Research, which gives internships to high school kids. We do general advocacy for software freedom, and we do quite a lot of policy work. And then we also support our member projects, who are free software projects that are we're their nonprofit home. And then finally, part of our advocacy is we do conferences. And so by the time you all are hearing this, we're going to be looking forward to our second annual FOSSE, Free and Open Source Software Yearly, which is a conference that was started this year in Portland, Oregon in July.
Before we go on into the subject, Karen, and this is much appreciated, don't get me wrong, you just touched upon a very serious issue, namely the right of people to know what's going on with regards to software and how it works. I can recall seeing, I think it was it was a piece somewhere, either a blog or something like, or a blog post or something like this, or maybe even a piece in the press about you and a pacemaker. And to me, that rang a bell at the very core of my soul, I'm tempted to say, because at the end of the day, if you're a patient, you want to know what's going on with a device that essentially keeps you alive.
That's right. I unfortunately was born with a heart condition where my heart is a very thick heart, and I generally don't have any symptoms from day to day, but I'm at a very high risk of suddenly dying, which is the term that doctors use of sudden death. And so I have a pacemaker defibrillator implanted that monitors my heart, so that if I go into a dangerous rhythm, it can shock me. And as a technical person, I went to engineering school and was a programmer turned lawyer. It caused me to research the safety and efficacy of these devices. And what I found was appalling, and it caused me to be really interested in the, figuring out how we could be able to make sure these devices were safe. And of course, that's when I discovered that when I really began to appreciate that all of these devices that are so critical to our lives are run on proprietary software that you can't look at, you can't change, you can't audit, even though that software is implanted in a device that is literally sewn into your body and screwed into your heart. And as I've lived with this device, at first I thought it was really about transparency. Like how is it possible that I could have a device in my own body where I can't see the code on it? And as I live with the device, I realized that I had all these experiences that demonstrated that it was more than just transparency. When I was pregnant, my device shocked me because my heart was doing what a normal pregnant woman's heart does. About a third of all pregnant people have palpitations. It's super, super common. And it would be fine in most cases. You would go to your doctor and your doctor would say, oh, you just have palpitations. It's really common. But for me, because I had a defibrillator, my device thought that I was in a dangerous rhythm, and it shocked me repeatedly. And even though I didn't need any treatment, my heart was not in a dangerous rhythm. It was just beating fast. And so the only way that I could stop the device from unnecessarily shocking me was by taking drugs that slowed my heart rate down so much that it was hard to walk up a flight of stairs. And it made me realize that, oh my gosh, this is more than just about transparency and auditability. It is very much about control, because these devices fail. And what will we be able to do when they fail? And, it showed this mismatch in our, like, the technology that we rely on, where despite sometimes the best, like often the best intentions of the manufacturers may not line up with the actual use cases, because only 15% of defibrillators go to people under the age of 65, and fewer than half of them are women to begin with. So the number of people who are pregnant with defibrillators is such a teeny tiny set of people. So it's not surprising when you think about it that there might be use cases that weren't planned for in the algorithms on the device, but it had this catastrophic result. And it just stands for the proposition that we need to do better. This device is a metaphor for all of the software we rely on. And then quite recently, I had this experience where I couldn't access the information on my device, and had to travel all over New York City to try to get that information because we didn't have interoperability. And every time that I live another year with this device, I realize that these issues around software freedom are not esoteric, they're not intellectual, they are immediate, and we need to do something about them now.
I couldn't agree more, Karen. Question, if I recall correctly, there's a motion being put in front of Congress or some other governing body in the US to make any medical software open source per se, if I understood this correctly.
There are a variety of initiatives that have been proposed, and they keep coming up, and none of them have been taken very seriously. I've been very encouraged by some of the more recent right to repair legislation that has passed in different parts of the United States, but it's slow going. So it's funny because you get excited for everything that's proposed, but then it just sits in committee or it doesn't go anywhere. And I think that the main thing is that we need to raise awareness so that politicians really feel like they need to be responsive to their constituents, and that these issues are not going away, and they have to educate themselves, and they have to figure out what to do. I know Bradley has some thoughts.
Well, and there's I think there's a big misunderstanding about how software has become so pervasive in the lives of everyday people. When you talk about, well, medical software ought to be open source, that needs to include Zoom. Zoom should be 100% open source tomorrow, because many people, at least here in the United States, are getting telemedicine, and the primary platform being used is Zoom for everything from mental health therapy to remote diagnosis and so forth. And I even know people who just see their regular primary care physician as telehealth instead of in person if there's no exam needed. So these kinds of situations, we're not really considering how much everyone's daily life depends on software. And the ironic thing is, every day it's true that open source and free software is more popular, and there are more lines of open source and free software code in existence every day than there ever has been in history. Yet, every single day, this huge paradox is true, that every single day there is more proprietary software that people rely on than ever before. So we have more open source than we ever did, but there's so much more software in the world, by more orders of magnitude than the amount of open source in the world, that most of people's software use every day is using proprietary software, and it's become almost impossible. Really, if you live in a city or an industrialized area, it's completely impossible to get through your day without having to interact or use some sort of proprietary software. And that shows us that we're in a disaster scenario with regard to software rights and software freedom.
It's so pervasive. Your kids cannot attend school without using proprietary software. And the surveillance that is built into all of that, and the reliance on centralized systems is so great that we are in this absolute emergency scenario.
Before we go back to proprietary software use in schools and education systems in general, I would just like to touch upon a further aspect that just crossed my mind with regards to proprietary software used in medical systems. And yes, Bradley, I get the idea that Zoom is pretty important with regards to telemedicine, but I reckon there's a slight difference between a device that is actually supporting your body 24/7 and a telecom network basically supporting remote diagnosis.
I agree completely. I wasn't trying to create a false equivalency. The point I was trying to make is that we're in danger in every aspect of our lives, from medicine to everything else. And a lot of times the threat is not so obvious. I think it's much more obvious what Karen has been through, which is completely horrendous. She has the right to see the source code that's running in of software that's running in her body, and it is a travesty that she's been refused by everyone, the FDA and medical device companies, from being able to see it. So that situation is clearly much more acute and much worse than the Zoom situation. But I brought it up mainly to point out that Zoom can't be trusted. Recently, just last year, Zoom unilaterally started feeding everybody's data, including all the data you had in chats, into machine learning training systems. Now they've backed off and said they're not doing that anymore, although there's no guarantees, and they can change back at any time when no one's looking. And it actually took the press almost, I think, 4 months to discover that they were doing this, because they changed the terms of service and then nobody noticed. And so these kinds of things are happening all the time, where your data, and possibly your medical data, is being used by companies to do whatever they want with it, because they're the technology company in the middle between you and your healthcare provider, or you and your government, or you and your bank.
Before we touch on the very important subject of GitHub and Copilot, let me go back to a medical device, Karen. Given the current litigations against big tech, like the Googles, the Microsofts, the Amazons of the world, by something called the FTC and other governing bodies in the US, has it ever crossed your mind to draw that very short connection between software used for medical devices must be open source because of monopoly reasons? Simple as that. Because if everybody has access to the source code, they can actually foster competition in that area. Because essentially what you're doing, if you're buying a pacemaker with a closed source code base, this essentially is monopoly, no?
Yeah, I mean, I love that. Oh, sorry.
By open sourcing this, you would actually create an equal playing ground for other players in that industry.
Yeah, I love that analysis, and I think it's right across different industries. Medical devices are funny because the companies wind up having, they each have their own little niche. And I think that the thing that's been the most compelling story on having the access to the source code on medical devices has been the examples of the small companies who have created critical devices that people absolutely need to live, and then have gone out of business. They were venture capital funded, or they were, they were all siloed within one company, and something changes and the company no longer supports it. And people have devices that are completely useless to them. A really good example of this is people had eye implants that actually helped people see who could not otherwise see. And the company ran out of funding. And over time, without any updates or support, these devices stopped working. And so you can, there are really amazing stories of somebody who was on the subway in New York and remembers the moment where they were trying to transfer trains and their vision went away. And they had no ability to update the software, which would have basically fixed the problem. And so these are very compelling stories that I think help people understand why this is so important. I think that the monopoly angle is a good one. The reason I believe that the medical device companies were so greedy to not share their source code was mostly around software patents, which was just a completely irrational type of argument. So I don't know, but these issues around the catastrophes of obsolescence are going to affect everybody over time. I mentioned that I could not get my defibrillator interrogated in New York City running around. I wound up with a small defibrillator manufacturer. It's a large one, but with a small imprint in the United States, because it was the only manufacturer in the United States that could have the connectivity, the wireless connectivity disabled in software. Otherwise, the devices are all broadcasting and talking to each other consistently. And ultimately, it was easier for me to get my defibrillator interrogated in Europe, where I was going for work, than it was in the United States, because the company has a much smaller presence in the United States than they did when I first got the device. So this is something that you could analogize to all of the different areas. And I think that what's really exciting in the medical device space is that in the insulin pump world, folks have really taken matters into their own hands and have been adjusting their own insulin delivery by exploiting security vulnerabilities in their insulin pumps. And it shows the promise of how, what we can do by using software to improve our situation. And I think that we do that across the board. And so having all of the ways in which we work towards software freedom together demonstrates how we can do things differently. And I think that this kind of connects to the issues of why getting access to your source code is so important, and why what the GPL guarantees, what copyleft licenses guarantee in giving users rights to ask for their software, is absolutely the most essential thing.
And this is what really surprised me in the light of the FDA. Sorry for the two listeners who are not familiar with the US system. The FDA stands for the the Food and Drug Administration of the US, essentially a governing body that has the final say of what goes and what doesn't when it comes down to food, drug, and the rest of it. So it does surprise me, Karen, I'm brutally honest with you, that this is not on the FDA's radar, because at the end of the day, we're talking about human lives here.
Absolutely. It's funny because I just think they don't, the companies are so they have so much in the way of lobbying efforts. And this is true not just in medical devices, but they insist that the only way to get things done is through proprietary software and centralized, corporate solutions. And we just see that's. Yeah, and I think that the experiment of copyleft in particular has not really been tried across the board in almost any industry. And I think that this is really the time to take the skepticism that the everyday person has for big tech solutions and to run with that, to try solving these problems in a different way that's software freedom, respecting, and decentralized.
Yeah, I've been listening to this with interest, because it's clearly in an ideal world, it would all be open source and freely accessible to see what everything runs. What about let's say the legislation about these things, though? I mean, if you take, for example, the future of cars and the software they run on, or even the defense industry, how are you looking at those kind of industries where clearly you have to have some guarantees in place, and do you really want to open source all the software that is built for these types of devices? And secondly, I guess all these proprietary software companies exist because of the commercial models that we have, right? That's why they are successful in what they do, and that's clearly we have a lot of initiatives around open source software to promote it and to help with funding for projects and things like that. But how are you going to compete against a $1 billion company, right, as a project with two people writing a similar piece of software?
So
few questions in there. Sorry.
There's two questions. I'll answer the first one first. The first question was more about the regulatory issues with regard to devices that relate to safety. Well, proprietary software has already killed people, and has killed people as recently as some of the Tesla car updates. The proprietary software in there has harmed people. So the idea that somehow open source and free software is gonna harm people, well, the proprietary software is doing a rather disturbing job at that already. And another point is that security through obscurity, we well know, does not work. Proprietarizing the software is just a form of security through obscurity. If you can't guarantee that when someone gets the source code, they can't break the device.
sorry, Bradley, for just the two listeners in the audience who are not familiar with the concept, we should probably explain what security through obscurity is.
Sure.
It's in the name, isn't it?
So in software,
yes and no.
lots of people spend a lot of time working on computer security, and computer security as a field, academically and in the industry, is nearby open source but orthogonal to it. And security researchers have long looked at the question of if you can make it difficult to figure something out, whereby you need an incredibly high level of technical skill and time investment, does that make the software more secure? That's a question you can ask. And study after study and basically all security researchers believe that it doesn't actually help, because the person who's most likely to want to do harmful things is going to invest the time. So if you have proprietary software, you can analyze that proprietary software through painstaking work, looking for flaws that you can exploit so that you can make the car's brakes not work, or whatever it is you might want to do. And that can be done with proprietary software, just like it can be done with open source. The counter argument that folks would make is, well, it's faster with open source. But the other benefit you get with open source, as has long been argued in open source and free software circles, is that the number of people who can vet the source code who are well-intentioned are much greater than the number of people who vet it that are badly intended to do something wrong. In essence, if something's proprietary, the only people who are going to do the work to figure out if there's security flaws in it are people who want to do nefarious things. If something is open source, there are millions of people, security researchers, users, folks in the world who would gladly use the software, look at the software source code to check it for security and safety as part of their other work. So there's actually a very strong argument that as a regulatory matter, we should encourage, as we were talking about with medical devices, also true with cars, that we should have the software open source so that there are more people reviewing it rather than just a small number of people at one car company looking at the software. So that's the first question. Your second question was, your second question could be summed up as, how do we deal with the fact that we live in a oppressive capitalist society worldwide at this point? Because that's really the problem there. Proprietary software exists as a handout to for-profit companies. When the various different legal systems that were designed around the world that permit a company to make something proprietary were created, they were designed to benefit for-profit corporate activity. They were designed to maximize shareholder value so that you could create software that allowed you to license it in ways that forced every single user to pay money to get a copy of the software. And if they didn't pay, it gave you mechanisms to take away their software. My answer to how do we fight these capitalist structures that want to proprietarize software, our answer ought to be, why should we be giving that power and authority over to these for-profit companies without a debate? Never, at least in the US I'm most familiar with, but I think this is true around the world, have legislatures and parliaments actually debated whether it was morally correct to give all this power, authority, and control of all our technology over to companies. And we even see it in new debates when the machine learning stuff became very much a center of debate and discussion. It's still ongoing now. That started in late 2022, early 2023. Everybody was just rushing to the idea of, well, let's make sure that this technology can happen in a way that lets companies make money with it, because that's the most important thing in our society, is companies making money, and any other concern is secondary. I think the first concern with machine learning or anything else is, how is the individual consumer and user being treated by these systems? And if they're being treated poorly, we should make solving that the priority, even if it means companies don't get to make as much money as they used to. Companies are very good at finding ways to make money in whatever regulatory regime they live in. The problem in software is our regulatory regime is completely biased towards what big tech wants.
And we have to acknowledge that the impact of these technologies is so broad. So it's not just the user, it's not just the consumer, but it's the number of bystanders is so great, and the impact is unprecedented and very hard to anticipate.
That makes perfect sense. So are we kind of, I guess, heading more towards a communistic model where we don't have companies making money? Is that what we're trying to get to? Because I mean, the legislation exists because it was voted. Clearly, there are some initiatives to change this, which is great. But it will be hard to change all of it because of the people that run these governments and are influenced by these governments, which are clearly the big tech companies. So it's not a simple solution, right?
It is so complicated, right? It's so complicated because we're entrenched in the system we're entrenched in, but that doesn't mean we can't change. I mean, my views about capitalism are different than Bradley's, so I don't want anyone to interpret this as being from my view as well. We do agree on a lot, and in my view, it's that regulation is absolutely essential, and what we've seen in Europe in terms of legislating big companies is I think an example of what is possible, and I would love to see more countries, especially the United States, embrace it. Embrace it and do the same thing. But what I want to see is new initiatives that use a nonprofit or alternate model for the creation of critical pieces of software. And it is not too late to do that. And we can do that one thing at a time. So we may not be able to move away today from every single piece of technology that we rely on, but what we can is start alternate initiatives for particular things that we count on.
You touched upon a very important subject there, Bradley, namely AI. And I can recall seeing a blog post in the context of something called Copilot and GitHub, especially with regards to license violation, which nicely brings us back to, I'm tempted almost to say to the beginning of the discussion, but maybe you can shed some light on why this is so important as of today, and maybe for the next, 100, maybe 120 years, maybe even more?
Yeah, so I will answer that question. I do want to answer Martin's point about it's been a while since I've been accused of being a communist because I believe in software rights and freedom. But I realize you weren't accusing me, but people do accuse occasionally, and that was a standard accusation. Most people called copyleft license communism in the early 2000s. Forbes magazine ran an article written by a person who later strangely went on to be one of the writers on the Silicon Valley television show, basically saying that we were all communists, that anybody who believed in copyleft license were communists, and we were pushing forward a communist agenda. So capitalists love to call anybody who wants them regulated a communist. I definitely am against unbridled capitalism. I don't think companies should set policy for themselves, which is what we have in the software industry right now. And it relates to Richard's question about artificial intelligence and machine learning. Right now, we have a system where companies just quote self-regulate, unquote, and it's true in the U.S. It's less true in Europe for sure. I think the European Commission has done a lot better job than U.S. regulators have. But in both cases, there's a lot of leeway. And in the US, just unbelievable leeway given to what big tech wants to do. And I think that we should have strong regulation. I think it's very hard to get because we have extremely corrupt politics around the world and in the US in particular. And I'm not picking a party of any sort in the US. I think all the politicians in the US are generally run by what their donors want and the people funding their campaigns want, as opposed to what the people want. That's pretty much true across the board. And therefore, it's very hard to get the kind of regulation we need. And so enters machine learning, right? We're in the situation where companies are moving incredibly fast with newer machine learning technologies. They're not really that new. They're just able to implement things that were thought of 10, 15 years ago because the amount of computing power and disk storage available has increased so much in the last 15 years that suddenly things that 30 years ago we could only imagine doing, we can now do. But the idea that we're just going to roll out these systems without any question to how they're going to impact the open source community specifically, which relates to your GitHub Copilot question, but all of society in general. There's really no interest in in any other than giving it lip service to really thinking about the question of how society is going to be impacted by machine learning systems that only a few companies control. No one's going to see, other than the people who work for those companies, the data sets that train these things. No one's going to see the pre-processing and post-processing, which is an incredibly essential part, particularly the post-processing of filtering what these machine learning systems output to massage it into what you want. That's just regular old software programs. It's just code. It's not anything new machine learning. It's just code on the back end that massages the output data. And none of that is being made open source at this point. And I think SFC at Software Freedom Conservancy, we're really the only organization that's demanding that we reach we aspire for something really, really ideal. And folks will see on our website, we've got a publication, hopefully will be out by the time folks hear this, that talks about what the ideal for machine learning ought to be, as far as making it so that it treats individual users and consumers correctly. And if big tech can't find a way to make money doing that type of machine learning, I think maybe we shouldn't have it. I guess that's somewhat of a socialist statement, maybe. But I do think that there will be plenty of business models around open source and free software for machine learning and everything else, as there always has been, because it's just the case that you can make money with open source and free software. You just don't make billions, you only make millions, as I've often said.
It's an interesting point. Having dealt with this area for a fair bit, I guess there is various parts to this. There is the data, there is the models, and things that are built on top of that. So, as far as I have observed so far, clearly ChatGPT is a different question altogether, but a lot of the other, let's say, big language models out there are open sourced, even developed by universities, but also commercial companies who are happy to outsource, open source those models. So were you specifically talking about the data or more about the applications built on top of that, or are you thinking of the ChatGPTs of the world there and the Microsoft?
Right, I'm thinking of all of it, the ChatGPT and the image generation systems and anything that's come out new since we recorded this, which there probably will be some applications of machine learning that are new between when we recorded this and when folks are hearing it. I actually think we should think aspirationally. One of the things I think that others in the open source world have made a mistake with, and this is not just true with machine learning, it's true with kind of everything we've ever done, is we've had a kind of a race to the bottom, where we said, well, here's the minimum things you have to do under the open source definition or free software definition to just barely make something open source or free software. And we've tried to make these bare minimum definitions for industry. I don't think it's our job as software rights and freedom activists to give the bare minimum. What we're supposed to do is shine the light to what would the ideal be. And I think with machine learning, the ideal is pretty obvious. Absolutely everyone should have access to the data set that trained it. Absolutely everyone should have the right to train the model on their own, to retrain the model on their own to change it. Absolutely everyone should have the source code to every single piece of software and its scripts used to control compilation and installation for anything used at any part in the chain. And for the application software, be it the ChatGPT interface or the Copilot interface, all that should be open source as well. And that's what a good society would look like. I realize companies
totally
are
agree.
legally required to do that, but that would be the right thing to do.
And the data sets.
We can have an argument about it.
Yeah, and the data sets in particular, they're built on our backs, right? Like we had this hilarious situation at SOC where we got this voicemail from someone who called us and said, I'd never heard of you all Software Freedom Conservancy before, but I asked ChatGPT who I should donate to. I said, I want to give $10 to an organization. Who should I donate to? And ChatGPT, first, it didn't tell me who to donate to, but I asked it and asked it and asked it. And eventually it said that I should donate to the Software Freedom Conservancy. So you'll see my $10 coming in. And I just wanted you to know that it was because ChatGPT told me to. And it was so funny because, it's not that Software Freedom Conservancy is so famous that everyone knows about us. I mean, I would love people to know about us. I would love for everybody to donate to us, of course. But it's because the information, the data set is created off of the massive amount of work that the free and open source software communities have been working on. And so this idea that it's available to us is essential because that is where it comes from.
Yeah, there have been also cases the other way around, right, where people have tried to take action because of certain data being used by these models, and without having given consent. So it's that kind of, yeah, I mean, you could say that conflicts with the freedom to use any data out there. Specifically, there are cases in the image industry, but also texts that have been used for the language models. So how do you see that? Is that the case that anything that's out there licensed in a certain way should be able to use by these training these models, or do you have some view on restricting that as well?
Well, they have to do it in compliance with the license, and this is where copyleft licenses are so important. We have examples of where Copilot has actually produced what is obviously GPL'd software copied out of a GPL'd project. And every time someone finds an example like this and publishes it, what Copilot does, remember I was talking about that back-end software that's just like regular code that works on the model after it generates something. They just keep adding code to that part. Obviously, we can tell from what happens that just says, oh, if you're about to generate this stream of code, just don't generate that because we've determined that was GPL. But that shows us they gave absolutely no consideration to the license requirements of copyleft. They have taken the position. This is true across. This is not just true of copyleft software. It's true of things like proprietary copyrighted images, where the companies have just said, "Well, we're just going to conclude that we can use this material that's public in any way we want, and we don't have to comply with any licenses, and we have no requirements." And frankly, the folks who are the controllers of proprietary copyrighted images, like Getty Images, for example, they're much more upset about this than even the open source people are. But the argument is the same: that there are certain legal systems already in existence that the big tech companies are just saying, "Well, this is all new," and this is a classic thing that big tech has always argued. You're just trying, they say, to slow technology down with your old systems. This is a new world. Everything's revolutionary and none of the rules apply. And by the way, we're making the rules and these are the rules we like. And that's what they're doing with this. And it's very interesting to note. We had discussions with Microsoft and GitHub when they launched Copilot, and I asked them this very pointed question. I said, it's obvious you used all of GitHub or large parts of what's on GitHub as open source to train your model, because we're seeing it output stuff from those projects. Did you also train it on all of Microsoft Windows, Microsoft Office source code? And if you didn't, why not? Because if your argument is the system is better if we have the most amount of code put into it, and once you put the code into it, there's no way you could be infringing anybody's rights, why didn't they put their own code into it? And they wouldn't even answer one way or another if they put their own code into it. I think the answer is no, they did not. And they certainly wouldn't answer why they made a distinction between proprietary and open source code. So it's clear that these companies are unfairly treating not just open source projects, but Wikipedia and all these other community-based knowledge collection projects that put together public-facing repositories of interesting, important works of human endeavor. And they're just saying they're all ours now. We can do whatever we want. And their reason for that is because machine learning is revolutionary. They have no other argument other than that, which is completely a meaningless argument, in my opinion.
Bradley, I couldn't agree more. On the other side, I reckon, and I suppose Martin concurs with me here on that, there are quite a few open source alternatives out there with regards to AI. As a matter of fact, blatant teaser, we did run a mini-series on artificial intelligence and deep learning about 20 years ago when we first started this podcast. No jokes aside, links may or may not in the show
You remember that
notes.
far back?
I tried
Well
to mind.
Yeah.
This is
And I'm
what
sorry to
the
interrupt you,
catalog
Richard,
is
but
for,
I
right?
remember when I was in graduate school in 1997, I sat in a machine learning talk by one of the other graduate students, and everything they were describing is just the stuff they do today. So their argument that it's revolutionary is sort of like, well, no, it's just we have bigger disks and faster CPUs now. It's not that the ideas are any different than what we thought of 30 years ago.
Exactly, Bradley, don't forget the money aspect, because Google has been pouring,
Yeah.
I don't know how many billions of
Well,
dollars
Google and Microsoft, right?
exactly
Right.
into that sort of technology for the last 20 plus years. But I think we could go on for hours and hours and hours on this one. Unfortunately, we have a time limit. So let's wrap this up. And before I forget, needless to say, we should probably do the Poxies as in the picks of the week.
Before we do that,
Yes.
now is the time for Bradley and Karen to do any plugging.
Yes, very important.
Of,
If you
of,
want to
of
plug anything,
yeah, anything that help that you need or anything you want to promote.
Yeah.
That's a good time.
We have plugs.
go for it.
So, firstly, do like ChatGPT tells you to, and donate to Software Freedom Conservancy.
Absolutely.
Conservancy.org. Also, when you're listening to this now, FOSSE is coming right up. I imagine our call for papers is probably for speakers is probably open. So go check that out. Plan on coming to Portland, US in July. Outreachy, our diversity initiative. If you are involved with a free and open source software project, consider having your community join Outreachy. If you know people who have experienced systemic bias, who have been discriminated against, tell them about the opportunities that exist. I think those are the main plugs. Bradley, what am I missing?
Links, of course,
Well,
will be in the
I
show notes.
think I will reiterate, we are a charity. If you're in the United States, it's a tax-deductible 501c3 charity. Consult your tax attorney to confirm. But
We did
encourage you to
an
donate.
episode on that as well, didn't we?
Oh,
We did,
great.
as a matter
Yeah,
of
so
fact,
go back
yes.
and listen to that episode if you're confused. But please do donate. And also, I by the time you all are hearing this, we have relaunched our podcast. I am sure many of the listeners here have come over because they liked the podcast Karen and I used to do years ago. We have relaunched a new podcast that you can find on Software Freedom Conservancy's website, and we encourage people to listen to it. And now that I've said that, we have no choice but to launch it.
Now we're stuck. Thanks, Bradley.
Absolutely. Martin, take a leaf from their book. They're doing marketing correctly. You just keep fighting the department.
Well, that's because they don't have
Anyway.
a department, right? They're just doing it themselves.
Okay, people, over to the Poxes, if that's okay with you. Karen or Bradley, what's your Pox?
So given that I was talking a lot about how political corruption can really influence the issue of proprietary and open source and free software, because big tech is lobbying and so forth, I really encourage people to find this very old U.S. movie. It's called Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. It's by a director named Frank Capra. It was released in 1939, so it's an old black and white film. But it is really the best film I've ever seen that really explains both what corruption is like and what it takes to oppose corruption, and the kind of person you have to be to oppose corruption. And it's been an inspiration. That film has been an inspiration for my work and my life. I saw it as a kid. I rewatch it regularly. And I think everybody should check out Mr. Smith Goes to Washington.
Nice.
I have
James,
an unorthodox pick, perhaps, which is chocolate. I picked chocolate. I
Any
recommend everybody
particular-
pick chocolate today.
This is a regulated drug in the US. It's not completely mistaken, right? I'm just asking. No, any particular reason? Any chocolate, or just kind of any particular brand of chocolate? Or Hershey, if you're listening to this show, the email address is sponsor@linuxinlaws.eu, in case you're listening. No, jokes aside, Karen, any
Yeah,
particular
I would
time?
say, well, about the time this is coming out is probably we're either coming up on or just having finished FOSDEM, where there's delicious
Yes.
Belgium chocolate, and we'll be at FOSDEM, and you should come and say hi to us. I also want to really plug this podcast for using free and open infrastructure to do we're talking to each other on Big Blue Button, and it's such a relief to be given a link to software we can use. So I'm really, I applaud you for that. And I would say that your pick of the week should be some free software solution that you can get somebody else to use with you.
Martin, if I'm not completely mistaken, infrastructure has just blessed us with a new BBB instance anyway, so that's the perfect opportunity, no?
I think BBB was a POX in the past as well. I'm thinking about
Fair
it,
enough.
yeah.
I mean, Kara just mentioned any open source software solution, so that counts. Even if it's a zoo of 20,237,000 components
running on some slightly outdated operating system.
Exactly.
Never mind.
Never mind. Exactly. I mean, exactly. I mean, BBB, if you're listening, and of course we had you on the show previously. Jokes aside, you are doing a very valuable service with that software because Linux in-laws had been running on BBB. I'm tempted to say for almost 2.5 years.
I think many schools as well, right?
Yes, many schools and all the rest of it. And of course, Linux in-laws being the important keyword here. No mind schools or not. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Martin, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, this is not my POX of the week, but I was just going to ask Bradley if he's heard of a program called Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister that was made in Britain, which is also...
Bradley, yes. Very important. If you can't get to sleep, this is the TV show you want to watch by all.
No. This is also a political satire, which
same
it's
thing.
Excellent.
Yeah.
What's it called exactly? I'm trying to search
Yes, Prime Minister.
Yes, Minister and Yes Prime Minister is the follow.
My spouse has, in fact, my spouse loves British television, so she has indeed watched it, and I'm sure she can point me in the right direction to see.
All right, great.
Absolutely.
Sorry, that wasn't my fault.
Martin uses this as a replacement for or substitute for prescription drugs, so it must work.
No, this only works if you have some concept of the English language by actually living there. Otherwise, it's a bit complicated to follow.
That rules out what about 90% of the British people?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. Anyway, so Martin, I keep interrupting. Your call.
My actual POX is a series called Hijack, which is on Apple TV, I think, only. But it's one that I, let's say, watched in one sitting the whole series. So it doesn't happen very often for me. It was definitely worth watching, and it has one of my favorite actors in it, Idris Elba. If you're familiar with him.
Your favorite lecturers?
Actors.
Sorry. I keep getting confused. Okay, fair enough. Yes.
Act. What about yourself?
Yes. What about myself? People that act exactly like myself. No, I would the POX of the week, or my POX of the week is actually a movie called Red Dragon. It's yes, it is. It would be. It's about a sequel to the Silence of the Lambs movies in terms of Hannibal Lecter being in the cell. If you have sat through the pandemic watching Zoom backgrounds and Microsoft Teams backgrounds, all the rest of it, and if you notice a certain cell in a basement, it's more than likely that cell from the movie. Links will be in the show notes. To say, I won't give away too much, but essentially, it's about an FBI agent that is aided by a lunatic, namely Hannibal Lecter, in a cell tracking down a serial killer. The rest you will find on IMDb and, of course, in your favorite streaming service. As I said, I won't give away too much, but if you're ever into riveting thrillers, that's one you don't want to miss. It's ancient. It's about 20 years old, give or take a few, but that doesn't take away from the suspension. And with that, Karen, Bradley, thank you very much for being here.
Indeed, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And
it's been so much fun.
Keep up the good work.
Well, and thank you all, and keep up your good work. We're fans of podcasts ourselves, and
Thank
have
you.
one ourselves, and we love there being lots of open source and free software podcasts out there, and we're so glad you all have continued to do it for so long.
We
So
are
great.
we are rebels at the heart anyway, so that makes us the four of us, right? Anyway, okay. This is the Linux in-laws.
You come for the knowledge.
But stay for the madness.
Thank you for listening.
This podcast is licensed under the latest version of the Creative Commons license, type Attribution Share Alike. Credits for the intro music go to Blue Sea Roosters for their song Salute Margaret, to Twin Flames for their piece called The Flow, used for the segment intros, and finally to Celestial Ground for their song Sweet Justice, used by the Dark Side. You find these and other ditties licensed under CC at Jamendo, a website dedicated to liberate the music industry from choking copyright legislation and other crap concepts.